Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. This last week has been big for economic news around the country, so I figured I would talk to Kevin Milligan from UBC and try and get a read on what all of this means. So, Kevin, first up was the Bank of Canada mandate renewal. Tell us why this is important and what it signals.
Yeah, this was definitely a big week for economic policy, and we did start off on Monday with Bank of Canada. And what's important about this is the way we've set this up since early 90s in Canada is that the finance minister gives explicit instructions to the Bank of Canada. It's a joint statement, so I guess they agree on this, but this comes from with strong input from the finance ministry to the Bank of Canada saying this is what your job is for the next 5 years. And that's important because, in any kind of democracy, you have some parts of the government system, be they judges or the Bank of Canada or whatever, that are kind of have some degree of independence from the day-to-day politics.
Yeah.
And that's important because, you want judges to do their job without thinking about whether they're going to get reelected or not, as they do in the US.
Yeah.
And same kind of thing with the Bank of Canada. You don't want them to be worried about the ups and downs of opinion polls. So the way we've kind of squared this of having, that operational independence, but combined with some democratic accountability, which is also important, right? We don't, this affects all of our lives, and there needs to be some accountability for that. And so the way we kind of put that together is once every 5 years, the finance minister gets together, the Bank of Canada, and gives this mandate. As it turns out, that 5-year mandate was up right now in the middle of this inflation cycle. And so that made it extra interesting to see what they came up with.
Yeah. And so it's essentially renewed for the same interest targeting of between 1% and 3% with an average of 2%. But there was some added language in there around jobs, and that's what got a lot of people talking. So explain that for us and why this is kind of important.
The old mandate was for a target range of 1% to 3%, which is the middle point is 2%, which we refer to it often as the 2% target. And that was it. It was very short. It was, most of the mandate renewals would kind of happen very quickly, under a page, and away it goes. This time, there was some pressure to expand the mandate beyond the 2% target to include things like employment, a focus on climate change, focus on inequality, other items. And there is some precedent for this. The United States, since the 1970s, has had an explicit dual mandate for both looking at inflation and maximum employment. Similarly, New Zealand has just introduced a dual mandate. They had a very focused 2% target like Canada. So there was, some precedent out there, and people have argued that the United States inflation performance until recently has not been worse over the past few decades than Canada. So maybe this is okay. So that's kind of where the debate was. What we saw come down the pike on Monday was an attempt to kind of walk a fine line between these. So the first thing is that very clear in the statement that the primary responsibility, and looking for the exact words here, the primary objective of monetary policy is to maintain low, stable inflation over time. So that, to me, that's unambiguous. That's job number one. My opinion is that that's the right thing to do. You have an institution, they have that we can measure inflation pretty well. They have the instruments that allow them to affect it. And so, giving a nice, clear and direct mandate like that, I think is the right choice. Other economists differ, but that's my view, but it's clear that's what's in there.
Yeah.
That is the primary goal. Now, wrapped around that primary goal, there is, I've underlined some words here, climate change, inequality, maximum sustainable employment. Those are kind of words wrapped around that primary mandate. They've made clear that it is the primary mandate to control inflation. Mm-hmm. But in that context, they've asked the Bank of Canada to keep note of things like inequality and maximum employment, and look at the impact of climate change on the economy. So that's how they've done it here. Some people have said that this goes too far by giving them too many targets? And my response to that is, I don't think so, because they made very clear it's the primary target to focus on prices, and that these other things are subordinate to that primary goal. So I think that's clear.
And there was also some talk, some pushback from the bank itself saying, like, we're already looking at some of these things already. So this is just kind of making it clear that, these are things that are under consideration.
Yeah, so that's exactly what the bank has argued, and others have argued, that this is, just making explicit what was already implicitly there. We've heard the words out of the Bank of Canada like climate change and inequality and employment. They'd certainly look at these things, informing their view of where the economy is going. And I don't think that's new. So some people have argued this is simply a nothing burger. Those are all just empty words. And I don't think that's true either. And the reason I don't think that's true is just my experience in government, and in my experience watching government, is things like the mandate letters that we saw come out yesterday for each of the cabinet ministers, things like the speech from the throne. What I see is, like, at the ministry level, the ADMs and the directors, they all focus on, the speech from the throne said the focus ought to be this. So then they try to align everything they do with these one sentences, like literally one sentence in speech from the throne can lead to big action within a ministry trying to align what they're doing with what they see in the speech from the throne. In the same way, I can totally foresee a research manager at the Bank of Canada seeing someone say, should I devote my time to this climate change model and how it might impact the economy? Is that a good use of our time? Well, they would look at what's in the mandate and say, actually, we better do that, because when the governor goes to the finance committee and is asked by someone, where is your modeling of climate change on the economy? It's in the mandate. The governor better have a good answer. And so I think, maybe this is small potatoes, and I won't say it's not small potatoes, but it is something. I think it does, by having it explicitly there. My experience in government is that the words on paper actually do change things as you filter down throughout an organization. And so, the bank might argue, well, we're already doing that. Well, maybe they're going to have a bit more fire under their feet to do it and do it well, because if they don't do this and don't do it well, I think the governor will be asked a lot of questions at the finance committee. Then that's appropriate, right? In a democracy, this is the mandate that the democratically elected people gave the governor, and it is his job to fulfill it. If he does not do it now, really, you will see MPs waving this thing around saying, did you do this or not? I think that is exactly how this ought to work in a democracy.
All right. And so with that, we will go to Tuesday, which was the fiscal update from the government. And my reading is that it's looking a little rosier than we thought back in the spring budget. I want to hear some of what you picked out of what they had to say.
Overall, it was definitely the case that the numbers were a lot rosier than we were expecting as of April. And actually, if you dig into the numbers, a lot rosier. We're talking over $30 billion improvement on the 2020-2021 year. So that's like the year that ended, ostensibly, March 31st, 2021.
Yeah.
It's like whatever that is, 8 months ago. So there's a $30 billion improvement in the bottom line. Why was that the case? Increased tax revenue, decreased need for things like the wage subsidy. We didn't end up taking up as much as was allocated in the budget. Why did this number change even after the budget in April? The answer is some of this information trickles in. People can still apply for the wage subsidy, backdated a bit. The tax revenue comes in with a bit of a lag. So it's normal to be a few $1 billion difference. The fact that it was $30 billion difference or more, that was kind of big. And the same thing for forecasts for the current fiscal year, of which we have 3.5 months left. Again, like a $30 billion change in expectations. Now, so you have this big windfall that they weren't expecting. What happened to that is a lot of it got reallocated and respent. And so what you saw was for the current fiscal year, bigger set-asides for health expenditures, for Omicron preparation, for the recovery of the transportation infrastructure in BC. So there were billions set aside for these things, and that kind of ate up that extra windfall. Going back to the previous year, what I found really raised my eyebrow was they were actually able to backdate some of the settlement for the First Nations welfare for children. Excuse me.
Yeah.
They backdated some of that. Money that was allocated now, backdated to the previous fiscal year that was, we thought, already in the books. And so that was, again, how that deficit from 20 to 21, even though there's a big windfall, it did shrink by 10 billion, but a lot of it was kind of these reallocations. So that kind of raised my eyebrow that they were able to do that. There's some interesting accounting there. They have reported that they had this pre-cleared by the Auditor General, and I'm not the Auditor General. We have to go with the ruling that the Auditor General puts forward. But I'm always, whenever I see backdating of expenses or revenues or things, my eye always goes to that. And it certainly was allowed them to take that First Nations settlement of, I think it was about $40 billion, and kind of put some of it into back years, and makes things going forward look a lot better than if they had to book that full 40 billion going forward.
Yeah, and it was really like 20 billion for the settlement, 20 billion for fixing programs going forward. But yeah, it's about an envelope of about 40 billion altogether. So
yeah, but accounting issues aside, the big picture here is that the economy did very well, and that led for better tax revenue, and it led for lower need for these kind of emergency program spending. And so when you look at that, the metric that I look at most carefully is the debt to GDP ratio, which takes a look at how big our debt is relative to the size of the economy. And it was projected as of April to kind of hover around 50%. In the update that we just saw, it's going to come in for the current year at more like 47, 48%, and is projected over the next couple of years to get down to like 44%. So what I find curious about that is many of the critics have said things like, well, this government is spending too much. They should shut down emergency spending. They should focus on a declining debt to GDP ratio. And when I look at this update, I say they've shut down emergency spending. They have a clear negative path, downward path for the debt to GDP ratio. And I'm kind of curious about, I think the critics ought to take the W here. I mean, they got what they wanted. For sure. I frankly don't understand where the critics are coming from now. It's like, do they want us to push to deficit zero next year? To my mind, you could do that, I suppose, but that would involve, some very serious cuts or some very serious tax increases, which in the current environment, I don't think is appropriate.
No, for sure. And there were two other kind of narratives that came out of this, one of which was the notion that these windfalls are simply as a result of the greater inflation, which has also led to certain, I would say, almost conspiracy-minded talking points that the government is essentially ramped up inflation for the sake of bringing in more revenues, which I don't think is really happening. But this talking point is being put out there. So I was just wondering if you can possibly debunk that a little bit.
So what we've seen over the past year, especially since the update in April, is the economy has run hotter than we expected. We see that in the labor force survey, where the proportion of 18 to 64-year-olds that are currently employed is at an all-time high. I mean, that is stunning to see. We see recovery for women. We see recovery for young workers. Those are areas where I was quite concerned about how quickly those things would bounce back. They've seemed to have bounced back very well. The economy is running hot. That is clear. A consequence of the economy running hot is that we have both the good things, which are like high employment, and we have a GDP that grew by approximately 12% in nominal terms, which is just insane to think about. The flip side of that is inflation has been running high. And, those are two sides of the same coin. The economy is running a bit hot. Inflation is going to be running potentially a bit hot as well, especially when those particular sectors of the economy that are constrained a bit by supply chains and stuff are leading to that as well. So to me, what's driving tax revenues high is that the economy is running hot. That's also something that potentially is contributing to part of the inflation picture. And so to me, what's driving both of those things is this fact that the economy is running hot.
Okay. And the other thing that has been said is that there's still no real growth plan in this update. This is tending to come from a certain crowd for whom it's 1995 and will always be 1995. But I know this is something that you keep pointing out, so I'm just wondering if you can just remind us of what's going on here.
Yeah, the debt to GDP ratio coming down nicely, in part because of the big nominal growth of GDP, has led some critics to say, well, look, that's good. Thank you for that. But we have to look forward and ensure that the economy continues to grow. And they are 100% right on that, that as we've seen, why did the debt to GDP ratio fall so quickly? Part of it is the debt increased a bit less than we expected. But the bigger thing, when you actually dig into that math of that ratio, it's the bottom part of that ratio, the denominator. The GDP grew so fast that the debt shrank in comparison to it because the GDP is growing so fast. So looking forward over the next 5, 10, 20 years, the best path to shrinking our debt back down to a long-run sustainable level is by growing GDP. So the critics are exactly right that that should be the focus. Where I have some difference with some of the critics is the idea that there is no growth plan. That's just belied by looking at things like what was in the budget. The minister's mandate letter, literally the first bullet point was, you got to grow the economy. So it seems like, there is emphasis on it. There's a plan there. Critics it's very fair game to say, I don't like your growth plan, but to say that the government is not focused on it seems a bit odd. The other thing is, what I would like to see is lots of focus on very tangible suggestions for how to grow the economy. Again, fair ball to say, I don't like the government's growth plan, but I think they do clearly have one. Their vision is one of growth through inclusion. This is, as an example, I saw a headline about a new program for Black-owned businesses to look more at lending to Black-owned businesses. That is a plan. Some would argue this is just some kind of like token diversity thing, or this is just like trying to get points for pandering to some group. I guess you could look at it that way. I look at it as Black Canadians are Canadians, and the growth that they help to generate for the economy is also valid. Those dollars matter as much as dollars from other parts of the economy. And if we can unlock the entrepreneurial spirit of all Canadians, including Black Canadians, I think that helps to grow the economy. The childcare program is going to help unlock long-run labor force participation by women. That's clear as well. Again, you could argue that's some kind of sop to an equity group or something. Others argue that it's a growth plan. So that's where I'd like to see the debate going, is saying, look, these kinds of growth through inclusion, that's a model the government's put forward. Show me that the numbers are wrong on that, or show me that you have a better plan, and we can have a good debate about that. That's where I'd like to see the debate going. Where I'm a bit concerned is sometimes it's like, if you don't cut marginal tax rates on high earners, therefore it's not a growth plan. It seems to be what some people want to have. It's like the only growth plan that they will recognize as a growth plan is one that comes from like 1990s thinking that the only way to do this is to cut marginal tax rates on high earners. I think there are other growth plans we could have, and I'd love to see them put forward. But this should be concrete, because the government does have, to my eyes, a fairly concrete plan. And maybe some of these elements of it are weak and the numbers don't support them. Let's get at that directly.
Okay. And with that in mind, the last big item this week was the inflation data came out. It was flat for this month with the previous one. I saw some indicators in there that looked like they were also keeping flat. So I'm thinking maybe there's a sign that some prices will start stabilizing. I just want to get your thoughts on this.
Yeah, so we got on, it was Wednesday, we had, what a week, huh? On Wednesday, yes, we got the latest inflation numbers. And what I was really watching was, when you have this year over year comparison, the numbers we got now are from November. So what drops out of that year over year is what happened last October to November in 2020. So again, when we get the December numbers in January, the year over year will now switch to December rather than comparing November's. So I kind of look at what month is dropping out of that comparison to get a sense of where this is going. And what we saw was that inflation that we saw in November versus October 2021 was kind of in line with what we saw in October versus November 2020, which is why the overall headline number stayed at right around 4.7%. So when I look at that, when you look at what happened December 2020, there was actually a drop in the price index. So when we look at what numbers we're going to see for December, when those numbers are released in January, it's going to be pretty hard to keep it capped at that 4.7 unless we see, a drop in prices between November and December, which, could happen. So what I'm saying is there's these kind of transitional dynamics when you're looking at what's happening now versus the comparison year.
Okay.
But after December, we get into comparing 22 to 2021. My view is that things are going to start to come back down as we get into 2022, because we're comparing to a year that already had the high prices kind of baked in versus this base year effect that we've been seeing of 2020. So that's what I've been looking at. Now, Dale, when I see your writings on this, I know that you focus a lot on like the energy component versus the core component and what is happening with energy prices. And what we've seen is, gas prices here in Vancouver have actually come down by like 10 or 15 cents versus November and October. So that's something that's very volatile. It goes up and goes down. Yeah. So it's quite possible that those volatile components are going to actually help pull inflation down a bit in the next print that we see. I know you watch those closely, Dale. Is that what you see in there as well, of those kind of the core versus volatile components?
I don't know that I see enough of a trend there personally. I'm just kind of keeping an eye on the fact that this is a global issue right now with energy prices, because there were fuel shortages in a lot of major countries who were then starting to substitute their other fuel sources with oil while production's low. And that's partially what's driven the prices up. And that's just something that I'm kind of keeping an eye on, because that's not something that the government of Canada can really do anything about. And that's not something that the Bank of Canada raising interest rates is going to do anything about. So that's kind of why I've kind of kept an eye on those particular indicators, because that's kind of, as everyone's demanding the federal government needs to do something about these prices, I'm like, well, here's where the prices are coming from. What exactly do you think they can do about that? So that's kind of where my thinking goes.
I think that's the right focus. All these things of what month is dropping out, is it energy prices this month or beef prices? These are kind of really into the weeds. The big picture that comes out of that is, when we think about what policy should be doing going forward, do we want to set policy on December 17th, 2021, based on the fact that gas prices were high in October? Do we want to set policy on December 17th, 2021, based on the fact that there are supply chain issues still hurting the Pacific trade and container ship clogs in ports? Does changing policy today in terms of interest rates, in terms of cutting back on emergency spending or whatever policy you have in mind, does that fix those problems? And my answer is, I don't think they do. Gas prices go up and gas prices go down. Unclogging the ports is a really important issue, but monetary and fiscal policy aren't going to fix that right now. And so when I think going forward, that's where I again want to focus. Tell me some concrete policies we ought to be following that might help with those issues. My guess is that the CPI measured inflation is going to kind of turn a corner early in 2022. That's just a guess, based on my reading of getting into the weeds of exactly what is being measured. But the bigger picture is, what policy should we be pursuing? When I look at the problems that are leading to the high inflation, be it energy prices that were high in the fall, be it ports that are clogged, I'm less concerned about making a big change in policy right now when I dig into those weeds to see what's driving things.
For sure. All right. Well, thanks so much for doing this. It's been a very busy week to try and keep up with all this, and I appreciate your walking us through this.
Happy to help out, Dale, and happy holidays to you and all the listeners and viewers.
All right. Same to you. Thanks.
And that's everything for this week. I'm going to take the next couple of weeks off for the holidays, so we'll see you in 2022. Don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.